Welcome to Scotland Hill Farms and week 4 of the Pantry Challenge. So we started out this week with some steaks from our own beef cows. I like to put them on the cast iron skillet. I put a little bit of homemade steak seasoning on them, and then I sear them on both sides, and then I put them in the oven at about 400 degrees, and it depends on how big the steaks are. I started out with 10 minutes. I think I did end up putting them in for a few minutes longer, but just until the doneness that you like them on the inside. We like them kind of medium well. I was just looking through our back cupboard to see what to pair them with. I thought this unsweetened applesauce would work well. We're really trying to just use up what we have left. I'm down to the bare minimum of vegetables, so I thought I would just make a salad with a few carrots and a little bit of cucumber and celery that I had left. When the timer went off for the steaks, I checked them out and they looked pretty good. I did check the center of them and they were cooked to medium well. I like to just let them sit on the pan for a few minutes to redistribute the juices. And we paired those with some baked potatoes from our own potatoes that we grew, some salad with leftover vegetables, a loaf of Italian fresh made bread that someone had given us, and the applesauce. And that was a great meal. I had this cabbage that I wanted to use up, and we don't eat a lot of cabbage in our house. Once in a while, I grew some last year, so we used a little bit, but I haven't found a recipe that everyone actually just loves. I like to have some coleslaw, so I thought on this night I would make just a little bit into some coleslaw, and I would use the majority of it for crack slaw. Crack slaw is something my family will eat. They're not crazy about it, but when I put meat in there with it, they will eat it. However, my daughter does actually like crack slaw, so I told her that I would bring her some over, and I also made enough out of this to give to my mom and dad, who also enjoy it very much. So I'm just slicing up the cabbage as thin as I can get it. Cutting up cabbage is not my favorite thing to do. It's fine once the core is cut out, but I find it difficult to cut the core out, and of course it makes a big mess while you're cutting it. I then went over to the stove and started browning up 1.5 pounds of ground beef to put in here. I do like to put in sausage sometimes, but seeing as I know my daughter wanted it, she doesn't really like sausage. Once the meat was all pretty much browned up, I came over with the cabbage, and I'm going to add that right into the pan, and I ended up making a big mess, of course, with it overloading the pan. But cabbage is something that cooks down quite a bit, so even though this pan looks loaded, it will cook down quite a lot. I just put the cover over the pan and turn that down and let it cook. While I'm making a big mess, I figured I might as well cook up some sausage and just have it set aside for another meal, because I don't like to waste my time in the kitchen. So while I'm waiting for that cabbage and beef to cook down, I pulled out a package of sausage and I'm cooking that down. We'll probably use that for some breakfast sandwiches at a later time. Now you can see that cabbage has really wilted down. It's only about half filling the pan, and I'm going to add my seasonings. So we're not huge fans of ginger, but I do like the flavor of it a little bit. I just add in a little bit of ginger. It's probably not even half a teaspoon. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add in some of this minced garlic that I've got in the fridge, probably about a tablespoon of that, just to taste. And after that, I'm going to add in, it's really only probably a teaspoon, maybe a teaspoon and a half of sesame oil, just to give it a little bit of that flavor that really gives it kind of an Asian flavor. And I'm going to add in a few of these red pepper flakes. And I only added in a tiny bit at first, and I did go back and add in a little bit more after I tasted it later and let the flavors meld together. We don't like really hot food, but this didn't really have any heat at all. I'm going to go ahead and give that a really good stir just to get all those spices and garlic mixed in there. And then I'm going to keep it on a very low heat just to let it cook down a little bit more, let those flavors kind of meld together. And I almost forgot to add in my coconut aminos. I like to use the coconut aminos. You could also use soy sauce with this. And again, it's really just to taste. Here is what it looks like when it's all done. It's been cooking for probably another 10 minutes. And here's my son's plate. You can tell that he's not very fond of casserole at all, but we served it with some corn and some bread. The next day was a pretty cold day, and we hadn't had chili in a while, so I decided to make that. So I got out a pound and a half, that's what ours are packaged in usually, of ground beef, and I browned that in the Instapot on the saute function. And then I just went through my pantry shelves. We don't really care what kind of beans are in ours, so I used a can of Great Northern beans, a can of home canned black beans. We really like a lot of vegetables in our chili. My kids actually don't mind having vegetables in their chili. So I chopped up 3 or 4 stalks of celery, and I'm going to add in 2 cans of carrots once that's all cooked. Since those are already cooked, I don't want to put them in the Instapot to cook them again. And these are some home canned chili sauce that I did out of our fresh tomatoes and vegetables this summer. And all the seasonings are already in there, so I just have to put those in. Later, I did go back. I put this on for about an hour, and later I did go back and add extra ingredients. I really wanted this to be a full pot of chili, so I just threw in some extra cans of some of that chili base and some of my vegetables, and it made a great big pot. We served that up with some corn chips that I had in the pantry, some sharp cheddar cheese, and those are actually some cream puffs that a friend had given us. Another thing that I did this week was make some butter out of some extra cream that I had. So I just put that in my blender, let it blend up until you can see the chunks of butter floating on the top. So they all kind of rise to the top, and you can see it looks like butter. And then there's the whey in there. I strain out the whey, and then I get just the butter solids left. And I rinse those out in cold water to get all the buttermilk off of it. And then I do add a little bit of salt to our butter. That's just the way we like to eat it. This only made maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of a stick of butter, but it was just enough to have some fresh butter and to spread on some crackers with our meal. This was the day I had set aside to do some meal in a jar canning. We have a lot of meat in our freezers, and we have more meat coming in at the end of February, so I wanted to kind of clean some of those out. So I plan to go ahead and make some beef stew. Just a canner full, so about 7 quart jars is what I can fit in there. And I had also gotten out a few days before a pork roast because I wanted to just make some pork in a jar, basically. It's just plain. I don't season it except with salt. So I'm starting out here by peeling up several carrots. I actually did a whole 2-pound bag of carrots. I peeled all those, and of course I'll keep those scraps to put in my bag in the freezer to when I make another stock. I'm cutting off all of the ends of the carrots, and then I am just going to chop those up into bigger pieces and add them to the jars. After the carrots were finished, I moved on to the potatoes. These are homegrown potatoes in my garden. I've had a lot of success growing potatoes. I think this was my 3rd year, possibly my 4th. This year I grew white potatoes and red potatoes. I just like to have a variety just in case one of them doesn't do well. Usually the other one will be fine. These both grew really well this year. And so I've got a variety of potatoes. I'm just taking all the peels off of the potatoes. Once I have all my potatoes peeled and rinsed off, I am going to cut them into chunks. I try to keep all the chunks that I'm putting into the jars, the carrots, the meat, the potatoes, roughly the same size so that they will just cook the same all the way through. So I cut up all these potatoes, and you can see there are little spots that I left on, but those will be fine. I'm going to fill up my jars with the rest of these potatoes, and then I will move on to the meat. All right, so I just finished cutting up my roast. Not the right roast to pick for this. It was an English cut roast, which maybe I've never had before. I didn't realize what it was. That's my pork roast I'm gonna do later, but this had 3 bones in it and these layers of fat. So it was really hard to cut it apart. I don't like to put fat in my jars because it can create a false seal or not seal at all. So I tried to cut off as much fat as I could. I put the meat on top of the carrots and potatoes. And I'm going to do 7 jars because that's what my pressure canner can fit. All I'm putting in is some salt in the jars, and I can season it up with whatever later, but probably just some pepper, quite honestly. So I'm going to get my, I have to clean off the rims actually to make sure there's nothing on it so we can get a good seal, and then I'm gonna put on my lids and my rings, and I already filled my pressure canner up with some water in the bottom. It's cold water. I'm putting cold water into my jars so you don't so they won't break. So cold into cold, hot into hot. All right. I just finished cutting up the pork roast. There was fat on there. It was much easier to cut off because it was kind of like a fat cap, so it's less meat wasted, I guess. It's more just fat. And I thought about putting this in the pressure cooker to make broth, but honestly, there's so much fat that it's just gonna be way too fatty. It won't go to waste because we have animals that are happy to eat that. So I ended up getting 4 pint jars of this pork. I'm gonna add, I think, a half a teaspoon of salt to that, and that's it. I'll fill them with water, wipe them off, put the lids and bands on, and I'm going to do these in my electric pressure cooker so I can do it at the same time. For supper this night, I decided to push the easy button since I had been canning all day, and I pulled some hot dogs from the freezer along with some homemade hot dog buns, served that with apples and a salad. Well, it is the next morning and I got my canning all done. I unfortunately had 2 jars that didn't seal. One of them was a pork and one was a beef stew, which stinks, but we will just use the pork and the beef stew this week. My family will be happy with that. I think probably the reason it didn't seal, so I'm kind of surprised more didn't, is that fat content that was in there. So yeah, I just won't use that type of roast to can anymore. Maybe I'll just use a rump roast or something I know that is a little bit leaner. The pork, it came out great, but I totally forgot that the last time I did it, I didn't actually add water to the jars. I added the salt and let the pork create its own juice. So what I found is this actually siphoned out a lot because I had the water filled up kind of to here to the rim, and obviously it's a lot less. So I think having that extra liquid caused siphoning. So again, I'm kind of surprised that more of these did not fail, but these are actually all nice and tight. The pork that I had to keep out because it didn't seal, I did taste it. It tastes wonderful, and that was just salt on it. I'm actually going to can up more of these pork roasts because I know I have a few in the freezer, and like I said, I want to get them out of the freezer so that I have room for the new pork coming in. So now I'll just take these down to my basement. These jars have all been washed off. I know meat doesn't look the prettiest in a jar, but it does really taste very good. And you can see all the carrots and potatoes and meat in that. And of course, it created its broth. I did label everything so I would know what it was because it's hard to tell after a while. It is about 6 o'clock in the morning the next morning, and I'm just making my son up an egg sandwich with ham and egg and an English muffin for him to take on his way to school. He does have to leave quite early in the morning. This is what we had for dinner yesterday, and I completely forgot to video while I was making it. So anyway, these are leftovers. I'm actually going to take this up to my parents' house. There are two really thick slices of meatloaf in here. And this meatloaf I actually had frozen. When I make meatloafs, I make 3 or 4 and I stick them in the freezer. Just because it's easier to do and it's nice to pull out, be able to defrost, and just stick it in the oven. And then these are homegrown potatoes. We call them creamed potatoes. So in this, I actually added in some ghee and some gluten-free flour and what did I add? Cashew milk to make a roux. And this is just pieces of pepper in it and just a little bit of salt. And it makes creamed potatoes and they are delicious. And with this, we just had canned green beans again because it seemed like it went along with it, but it was a really good meal. So I'm going to try to make some version of a broccoli and rice casserole. I'm trying to make it without certain ingredients, so this should be interesting to see if it turns out. I've got my rice going in the Instant Pot, 2 cups of rice, 4 cups of water, and I added a little bit of chickenless bouillon to that. And then over here, I've added in some vegetable bouillon, some cashew milk, a little bit of ghee. Let's see if I can get that into a sauce that tastes good. I've got some frozen broccoli over here. I'm going to use that. And then I do have in the fridge some of that pork that didn't fully seal. So I'm going to put that on top of that for those who want it. We'll see how it works out. This turned out really well. I really liked the sauce. I mixed that in with the cooked rice and broccoli, and I added this canned pork on the top. Hopefully everyone likes it. I'm serving that with some home canned carrots and some fresh apples. The next day, we decided to eat up that can of beef stew that did not seal, so this was the perfect amount. You can see all the good vegetables in there, and I thickened it up with some cornstarch to create a gravy, and I cut up some oranges. I am not going to be home for lunch today, so I actually doing an easy lunch. We have some of this home canned Sloppy Joe that was from 22, still perfectly good. My husband and son can just dump that in a pan to heat it up. I have some home canned peaches and some bread rolls, and those were from the freezer. And they feel really soft and good, and that's going to be their lunch for today. We are doing leftovers for dinner tonight, so we are having some of this rice and broccoli casserole. This one has some of that canned pork in it, some home canned carrots, and we have just a little bit of this unsweetened applesauce left, and that's going to be dinner for tonight. This is our big Saturday breakfast that we're having this week. My family wanted French toast, so I scrambled up about 8 eggs, added in some milk and some vanilla, and I'm making French toast. And this bread was bread that we had in the freezer, perfectly good, came out soft, and I'm also frying up some sausage to go with it. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you are enjoying our meals of the week during this pantry challenge. We are thoroughly enjoying doing it. Have a great week.